Springtime in Paris, 1940. Parisians watch in horror as Nazi forces march down the streets of their city.
The occupying troops took over in half a day. By noon, everyone was in place.
Beneath the streets, the invasion continues through hundreds of kilometers of tunnels. The Paris mines from the vast underground network where the French government had built bomb shelters. The Germans took over these shelters and reinforced them, creating new defensive concrete bunkers like the Médicis shelter.
Let's not forget that the Reich expected to last 1,000 years. Everything was built solid, thick, and made to last.
The Germans secretly seized a warren of tunnels beneath the Luxembourg Gardens and would have gone unnoticed were it not for the resistance. At the height of the occupation, two young doctors, René Suttel and Jean Talairach, dared to explore the underground tunnels. You're about to see their unpublished maps, drawn by hand over many nights, and to hear Jean Talairach tell the story in his own words.
I always went there thinking of the Germans.
Now we can reveal how they discovered the German troop positions and risked their lives on sabotage missions.
The resistance undeniably went through an extremely brutal suppression in 1944.
These heroes helped the French interior forces establish underground resistance headquarters, bracing for the fight that would liberate the city. Exclusive interviews and rare archives will take you deep into Paris's tunnels to shine a light on this seldom told chapter of the occupation. June 1940. After a lightning war that had decimated the French army in less than a month, the Germans arrived in Paris. An agreement between the French government and the German army spared the city from mass destruction. Paris was declared an open city.
Everyone fled. Paris was dead, but it was declared an open city, which meant there wouldn't be any combat. It was mayhem, a real fiasco. It was terrifying. The German army arrived in Paris from the north on the morning of June 14th, 1940.
June 17th. For the French, the war ended brutally. Marshal Pétain put out a call to stop the fighting and began negotiations with Germany. France was split by a demarcation line. In the north, Paris found itself in the heart of the new occupied zone under the command of the Third Reich. More Parisians, like many other people in the occupied zone, fled when they learned of the arrival of German troops. Those who stayed, abandoned by their army and their government, watched in shock as the Nazis paraded down the streets.
The occupying troops took over in half a day. By noon, everyone was in place. How was that possible? Simply because land registry maps were for sale to anyone at the Brown bookstore on Rue Saint-Lazare in the 9th arrondissement. And the Germans had already planned everything 3 years prior.
But from London, General de Gaulle encouraged the French to join him in retaliation in his famous appeal of June 18th.
The Battle of France was only one loss. They needed to keep fighting.
De Gaulle asked the Frenchmen still in the city or in England to join him. In 1940, defeat had traumatized the French. None of the parties, syndicates, or churches called for resistance. From London, de Gaulle gave them an alternative to Marshal Pétain's bleak resignation.
Without any organized resistance movement in the country, very few resisted. One of those who did was René Suttel, a young doctor in the south.
He had been a doctor well before the war. He had served as an army doctor during his military service.
René Suttel began to participate in secret operations in 1941. Living in Limoges under a fake identity, he was denounced and narrowly escaped Gestapo agents.
The only document we have is this fake ID, and the stories he told me about who he was and how he had to leave Limoges in a panic, because the Gestapo were waiting for him at his house. He just barely got away.
It was rare for someone to already have fake papers in 1940, and to be deeply involved in the underground movement, which meant sacrificing their family, their name, and their career.
Forced to flee hastily, Suttel arrived in Paris under his real name. He found a doctor residency at Sainte-Anne Hospital in the 14th arrondissement. Sainte-Anne, one of the oldest psychiatric hospitals in Paris, was a well-known establishment. René met another resident there who, like him, couldn't stand to see France in Nazi hands. Jean Talairach had worked at the hospital since 1940. A Gaulliste since the start, he had stayed in Paris with his mother despite the invasion. This footage of Jean Talairach is his only recorded testimony about what happened during the war.
One day, when I was in the on-call room, the man next to me was brutally pushed by a big guy with a smile on his face. It was Suttel. He said he couldn't deal with the other man saying bad things about Jewish people. Back then, it was really refreshing to meet anyone who was clear on where they stood, especially in 1942.
René Suttel and Jean Talairach were in the same class of 1942 through 1944. Trust and mutual respect developed between them, which quickly led to a strong friendship. Sainte-Anne, located relatively away from the Nazi command centers, was a large facility surrounded by walls, a small city within a city with the unique advantage of being geographically isolated. To the Germans, the hospital was anything but suspicious. Even Nazis within the building seemed to think the medical personnel was totally harmless. The pace of the work was intense for the young doctors who lived on site.
Resident doctors were housed there, and they were often on call. They spent most of their time at the hospital.
The hospital's isolated location, combined with the Nazi disregard for medical personnel as a potential threat, made the hospital an ideal location to develop covert operations. Military archives from the French resistance, preserved at the Château de Vincennes, prove that Jean Talairach and René Suttel joined a small group of resistance fighters based out of the hospital. They called themselves the Angels. Back then, it was more a political indicator than a mean for action. The residents knew they wanted to act against the occupying troops, but they didn't know how yet. At Sainte-Anne, like everywhere in France, daily life was peppered with alerts.
There were underground shelters in the hospital that were big enough for everyone at Sainte-Anne.
But the Sainte-Anne bomb shelter was truly unique. More than 20 meters below ground, it was connected to a vast maze of underground tunnels totaling 1,500 meters, which Suttel and Talairach liked to explore. Down one of the hallways, they discovered a heavy iron gate which was locked. They could see tunnels continued far beyond the other side of the gate.
Of course, the gate was locked.
By chance, Talairach knew how to pick locks. Fascinated, René Suttel encouraged his friend to do it. Jean and René didn't know it yet, but the opening of that gate would be the start of a grand adventure for the two doctors through the rest of the war. At the height of the occupation, they figured out they could use these tunnels to secretly leave the hospital grounds. But where would these newly discovered tunnels lead the two doctors? Gilles Thomas is a renowned expert on the history of Paris's underground tunnels. He's quite familiar with the tunnels that Jean and René discovered. They're still accessible today, even though certain parts are closed to the public.
The Grand Réseau Sud included all the tunnels beneath the 5th, 6th, 14th, and 15th arrondissement. They're about 20 meters below the ground and cover 770 hectares, roughly 1/10 the size of Paris, and between 250 and 280 kilometers of tunnels. Right now, we're in a former limestone quarry. These tunnels were built to extract the limestone that was used to erect the buildings on the surface.
The two doctors began to explore the city's underground tunnels. Often falsely referred to as the catacombs of Paris, the tunnels are actually much more complex and are built on multiple strata.
Paris has since built 2 additional metro lines, RER E and Line 14, that are about 30 meters below ground. The tunnels are about 20 meters underground. There's also the sewer system, which is barely below street level, as well as the metro, which runs through the middle of the streets, also just below the surface, since the metro's chamber is only 70 centimeters beneath the pavement on average. There are a few hospitals in Paris that have underground tunnels, like Bicêtre Hospital and Sainte-Anne, and it's always been a tradition for the doctors to go down there. They usually have an on-call room on the ground level, but they like to meet beneath Paris, beneath the hospital, in an on-call room in the catacombs.
For these young doctors, who spent all their time cloistered in the psychiatric ward, exploring the tunnels was exalting. Quietly sneaking underground into the tunnels became a sort of game for the Sainte-Anne doctors. Suttel loved history and was immediately fascinated by these mysterious tunnels. After the war, René Suttel wrote the following.
We were on top of this astonishing molehill that was easy to access. We had to keep it a secret, but we couldn't resist the temptation.
Suttel loved going down there. He was happy going underground. Suttel was inspired by the depths.
What was at first a lucky discovery quickly became a ritual, even an addiction. Jean and René worked at the hospital all day. Then they would meet every other night to discreetly disappear beneath the on-call room. In a letter to his family, Jean reflected on the experience.
At that time, I was a psychiatrist in the morning as clinic director, a neurosurgeon in the afternoon. And every other night I disappeared in secret into the tunnels until 6 in the morning.
It was a dangerous game. In total darkness and without bearings, the first and greatest risk was to get lost for good.
Once they started getting a little deeper, they realized they needed a map to avoid getting lost, because it was a maze. These are the maps, which they drew on sheets of paper this size. They were numbered to align them side by side. It was a hole, as you can see. This was part 17, and this was 6.
The maps were drawn by hand by Suttel and Talairach, using a simple compass and basic lamps.
Suttel loved going down there. He was always examining the ground and any historic traces more carefully than I was. I always went there thinking of the Germans. It was a way to resist. I went down there thinking about the war that would come the day Paris would eventually be liberated.
Paris, 1943. The presence of German troops was becoming increasingly oppressive. the locals' quality of life dropped due to the cold and lack of food.
My dad, who was 1.85 meters, weighed less than 65 kilos.
Jean Talairach wrote,
"We're hungry and we're cold because it's winter. We don't have enough money to buy anything on the black market. My mother resembles a skeleton, and I'm getting very thin. I don't feel well when I'm in the metro."
For the doctors, the tunnels became a way to escape reality.
Above ground was the occupation and the Germans, so if they were captured, their lives were at stake. They kept going because they forgot their troubles when they were underground.
At the same time, violent actions by the resistance became more common, which led to even more repression.
The Germans wouldn't tolerate any resistance. Repression continued to increase because starting in 1943, the Germans didn't believe the landing was going to happen, and they didn't want to take any risks. They couldn't allow what they called secret armies to form behind their backs. So their solution was to deport anyone who resisted. They were sent to disappear in the hell of the concentration camps.
Jean and René rubbed shoulders with Nazis daily in the neighboring building a few meters away. Being part of a resistance network was a major risk. It had to be kept an absolute secret, even among the medical staff.
It was a very hard rule to follow, because not only were they young, but also because the resistance developed through capillary action. People would recruit their friends or their colleagues, so people tended to chit-chat. That's exactly why many secrets weren't kept, which sometimes led to unfortunate consequences.
In a letter written after the war, Talairach explained,
A resident and a professor were arrested and then disappeared. We never could have guessed the horrors that were still to come. We could have been caught. Even those in the on-call room didn't know we went down there. There were 50 of us. 4 or 5 were Gaullists. 2 or 3 were pro-Germany and boasted about it. And everyone else was what we now simply refer to as reasonable people.
But despite the risk, the two friends couldn't stop going underground. In fact, Jean and René began to dream even more of liberation from the occupying forces by way of the vast underground network beneath Paris. The maps they were drawing could one day help the resistance and contribute to the fight against the Nazis. The doctors also knew that maps of Paris's underground tunnels already existed. Back then, only one official department was authorized to use the underground tunnels, the General Mining Inspection, known as IGC.
At the end of the 18th century, there were cave-ins, so they created a department to find all of the caverns below Paris and to map them.
But the IGC's maps were technical blueprints, hard to read and understand. Created for each sector individually, they didn't cover the entire network. René and Jean set out to create an entirely new map, both for navigating and for strategy.
Our map was made to allow laymen to access and navigate the tunnels.
It made it potentially possible for other resistance fighters to hide, escape capture, build ammunition caches, or maybe even lead a secret attack by making moves directly beneath the German soldiers' feet. But how could 2 young doctors with no map-making experience, no tools, and in total darkness have created such a precise map? Starting in 1943, the doctors went down with pencils and paper in hand. Below ground, where everything looks the same, they mapped every detail they could. Marks on the walls, centuries-old inscriptions, and various points of interest. The two friends accomplished their mission with incredible rigor.
My father told me he counted his steps and made the map using the compass and the number of steps in one direction, then the number of steps in another direction, after which they would draw it out.
The key element was to accurately outline the tunnels, which meant understanding where in the city they led. The two men began to make an inventory of all the exits to the surface. They would then canvass the city on bikes by day to find each corresponding manhole cover. It was a massive undertaking.
It was a lot of slow, difficult work.
A closer look at Suttel and Talairach's map reveals an impressive number of details and precision. Is it enough to find one's way through the underground maze? What's the scientific value of a map made by amateurs? Matthew Fernandez, an urban researcher, gives us the answer using a Geographic Information System, or GIS. He made a model of Suttel and Talairach's map and compared it with an exact topographical map of Paris made by Nexus.
What's interesting about Suttel's map is that they used real addresses. For example, look at the water reservoir of Montsouris. I'll tell the software to use these corresponding points and we'll see what we get. We can see that Suttel's map is extremely deformed, so it's not topographically accurate.
The same experiment with the IGC's map reveals very little distortion.
The General Mining Inspection spent between half a century and a century making these extremely high-quality maps, with a lot more means. So it's fair to say the two men worked quickly and still produced something that's pretty good considering their lack of resources.
It's okay that it's not to scale. The goal of the map was to help people navigate the underground tunnels. Many things are approximate from a topographical perspective. Suttel's map reminds me of officer sketches done during either war that explained a position to hold.
While topographically inexact, the maps fulfilled their purpose by enabling one to navigate underground with precision. But as they went even deeper and further, the doctors learned they weren't the only ones using the ancient tunnels. Between 1943 and 1944, the Saint-Anne resistance fighters made it all the way to the 5th arrondissement and mapped the entire sector of Luxembourg, a key zone to the German occupation. Beneath the surface, they found a series of developments and concrete structures, which they labeled as shelters. These were civil defense bomb shelters. To understand these structures, we have to look back to the prior war. In 1918, Europe emerged traumatized from an atrocious war. All the new technical innovations used in World War I stoked new fears of bombings and gas warfare, powerful weapons that killed soldiers and civilians alike. In the 1930s, the government taught the French people how to protect themselves during a bombing as part of a civil defense program by using underground bunkers during an attack.
There were 250 official waterproof and gasproof shelters built beneath hospitals, train stations, RATP buildings, the National Assembly, and the Senate.
But as seen on Suttel and Talairach's map, these French government structures ended up being used to reinforce German positions in Paris.
This is a shelter built beneath the Senate. It's a civil bomb shelter. This shelter was designed to protect around 300 people, both senators and Senate administrative employees. When the Germans stormed the government buildings, everyone went into civil defense mode. So the Germans knew that every sector had a high chance of having a fully or quasi-equipped bunker.
That shelter is 333 square meters, which is significant.
Occupied as of August 1940 and equipped with a direct telephone line to Berlin, the fortified Senate shelter was the most important underground bunker for German occupying forces in Paris. Over 10 meters underground, the shelter was built for high-ranking military personnel and equipped with the best technology of the time. Despite its impressive surface area, this first bunker, named the Presidential Shelter, quickly became too small to house everyone on site, which was around 1,500 people. In 1943, the Germans began new construction next to the Presidential Shelter and built 2 new bunkers, the biggest of which was named the Médicis Shelter.
Let's not forget that the Reich expected to last 1,000 years. It only lasted 12, but everything was built solid, thick, and made to last.
A proper megastructure with ultra-thick walls, multiple floors, and a reinforced concrete roof several meters thick.
The Germans held their positions thanks to concrete shelters and ground-level firing posts, which were obviously very effective.
Even more solid than the shelters built by the French in the 1930s, these impressive structures were the first German bunkers in Paris. But the Germans didn't stop their occupation of the Parisian underground there, as evidenced by these newly unveiled archives. This document is kept at École des Mines. It's another map of the tunnels made by the Germans. No detail was left to chance in their strategic occupation of the French capital. The Wehrmacht had its own geological department, a little-known department that may well have studied the French underground before the invasion even began.
Just before World War II, it became apparent that the German military intelligence service, the Abwehr, had expertly prepared their invasion.
It's important to note that the Germans were master map makers. They were excellent and incredibly precise.
In 1940, the Germans moved into École des Mines. The university, which had produced numerous high-ranking managers and scientists, had close ties with a key department, none other than the IGC.
Those who served as deputies at the IGC were traditionally École des Mines graduates.
The Germans simply took the maps created by the General Mining Inspection and copied them.
The outlines of the German maps are perfectly similar to those on the maps previously made by the IGC.
But in contrast to the maps being made at the same time by Suttel and Talairach, the Nazis' map only covered a single, well-defined sector, a strategic area for the occupation that included the Senate and its fortified underground bunkers. The entire sector had to be secured. In 1943, the Germans began major work in the basement of École des Mines, as seen in these documents. The Wehrmacht planned to connect a series of fortified bunkers built in the underground tunnels around the Luxembourg neighborhood. And so, just like the French resistance, the Germans began to map all of the surface access points to the underground.
The Luxembourg Gardens represent a very large perimeter. You had to always anticipate every possibility of attack, escape, and defense.
A few remains from this underground occupation are still visible.
Lycée Montaigne has 3 emergency exits. There's Hinterhof, the exit from the school's central courtyard. Saint-Michel, which is an escape via a spiral staircase in the front of École des Mines, and there's Notre-Dame Bonaparte, which exits inside the sector that was ring-fenced by the Germans.
All these developments were quickly added to Suttel and Talairach's map.
Inside, they built bathrooms, among others. They anticipated living enclosed for quite some time.
The map also shows that in 1943, the doctors found tunnels that crossed all of southern Paris, allowing one to go from Sainte-Anne Hospital directly inside the German zones. But the Germans knew that the ancient tunnels crossed into their area, so they sought to cut off access to avoid intrusion from any undesirable visitors.
The Germans knew that the underground tunnel stretched beyond the Luxembourg Gardens, so they isolated themselves by setting up electric alarms to keep people from approaching.
Now far beyond their first adventures beneath Sainte-Anne Hospital, the map shows the doctors visited the heart of the occupied territory and noted every attempt the Germans made to block their way.
First, they closed the bunkers and placed traps and alarms to keep people out. Then they lit them up.
From then on, knowing that any face-to-face contact with their enemy would mean death, Suttel and Talairach armed themselves.
I had a grenade in my pocket, and Suttel had a small woman's revolver. We would have been no match for the German machine guns.
Far from the Parisian underground, things were changing for Hitler's troops. The German army was pushed back to the Eastern Front, while the Allies focused on the Normandy landing. Across the French territory, the Germans organized their defense and actively tried to defeat the resistance.
From September 1942 to February 1943, the resistance swelled and repression became more extreme, which is sort of counterintuitive because you'd think that with the liberation on the way, the resistance would grow. But no, the resistance went through an extremely barbaric repression in 1944, and there were increased numbers of deportations and shootings.
In early 1944, the French resistance adapted their strategy. The time called for centralization to improve the efficiency and the coordination between the various networks, which were scattered around the country.
The FFI, the French Forces of the Interior, were created on February 1, 1944. The goal was to regroup all of the military or paramilitary forces of the resistance under a single organization.
They were all autonomous, but there was a general organization that provided structure for the insurrection activities to come.
The commander of the FFI officially reported to London, but there were also regional commanders. In the Paris region, based on who was available and the role of the National Resistance Council's military commission, Rol-Tanguy was put in charge of the FFI. Rol's great ambition was to first try and recruit all of the FFI forces under their authority and then coordinate a plan of action.
Around the same time, the French forces of the interior found out what the doctors were working on and decided to use it to their advantage. The two young doctors became literal underground moles for the Paris resistance, with new missions that were increasingly dangerous.
The resistance asked us to take care of the tunnels.
Their archive files indicate their new responsibilities. Starting in 1944, the doctors found themselves far from simple map-making as they shifted to sabotage.
Professor Talairach managed to cut off the alarms.
Jean and René started infiltrating the German bunkers and started adding every unlocked door on their maps using a symbol.
We picked so many locks.
This is a key that was made by Professor Talairach. It's clearly made by hand from a small piece of iron.
We went into the German bunker that was under the Lycée Montaigne, and we saw the Germans were building a shelter. We were tasked with examining the size of the bunker to gauge how to best bomb it from the street.
More than 20 meters underground and in total darkness, they sometimes brushed up against their enemy just above them. But the hope of liberation, which felt closer than ever, justified every risk.
The Germans only knew what was directly around their bunkers. They rarely wandered any deeper. It was easy, once we knew the catacombs, to turn around and get the guys chasing us from behind.
With plans for the liberation underway, their intel became even more valuable. In spring 1944, the map was almost complete.
They really created that map at record speed.
In 1944, the FFI General Staff operating above ground were at constant risk of being caught by the Germans.
For security reasons, they had several different homes and hideouts. Starting in autumn 1940, Rol-Tanguy and his wife Cécile Lebihan lived in total secrecy.
To carry out the Parisian insurrection operations, they needed to be in a safer, more discreet location. The long-forgotten tunnels were the perfect place to hide resistance operations. Between the end of winter and the spring of 1944, an FFI representative contacted the doctors at Sainte-Anne Hospital.
It was someone from the resistance who said their name was, I can't recall, Morel.
René Suttel wrote about the event, saying he was contacted by someone named Morel, who was interested in their map. An FFI agent wanting to understand the strategic potential of the underground tunnels. The young doctors took Morel underground. Even though it was just for reconnaissance, Jean and René took a big risk.
The bunker, which of course didn't have any lights, suddenly lit up. We were caught in the light, so we hid behind a pillar and didn't move for several minutes. And nothing happened. Then the light suddenly went off. We were extremely lucky that day. And if the Germans had been there, we would have been no match for them.
The real identity of the envoy remains a mystery.
Rol was a pseudonym used by Rol-Tanguy in 1944. That we know for sure. His service records from his time at the Defense Historical Service reveal the nickname Morel. We didn't know that until we looked at the files.
Rol-Tanguy used Morel as a pseudonym. But so did one of his lieutenants, a Parisian sewage system engineer named Louis Tavès.
Louis Tavès was an engineer who had been in the resistance since 1941 and was part of the Northern Liberation Movement. What's interesting is that Louis Tavès used Morel as a pseudonym.
Preserved archives about Louis Tavès prove that the FFI General Staff were supervising a group of map-making agents.
That's how my father gave this man his maps.
For the doctors, it was the culmination of over a year of daily work for which they had risked their lives. With Morel's help, the documents they had prepared with little hope and only rudimentary tools would prove to be of service to the resistance forces. On June 6, 1944, the Allies successfully landed in Normandy, less than 300 kilometers from the French capital. Hitler's troops were struggling on every front. The Führer was enraged. From Berlin, he ordered Marshal von Choltitz to make Paris the Stalingrad of the Western Front.
Dietrich von Choltitz, who had done dirty work in Odessa and wasn't known for being a good man, was in charge of carrying out the exit.
The resistance suddenly had a military value that hadn't necessarily been obvious from 1941 to 1943.
The Battle of Paris was imminent, and resistance fighters were in extreme danger.
Orders from the Wehrmacht command were to fight to the death against any gangs. What that meant is they were seen as terrorists. The Germans considered the FFI to be hired guns and slaughtered them as such.
Rol-Tanguy's team had no room for error. They had been based out of an apartment on Rue de Mont, but they needed to find safer headquarters. Someplace where the Germans wouldn't find them, where they could also easily communicate with the Allies and the various resistance groups.
In early August 1944, they wanted to place Rol somewhere strategic. The moving of his general staff, which also included his wife Lucy under the pseudonym Cécile, took place the night of the 19th to 20th, when they moved into the Denfert-Rochereau command center. The civil defense bunker offered excellent protection, and it even had a telephone system.
That bunker had been furnished underground with direct access from the materials testing laboratory located above it and connections via a stairwell and a cave ladder.
You had to have a password to get in or out. All that was precisely established and made it a real warlord's command center.
While the Nazis had occupied the city for 4 years, taken maps of the underground, and cut off the areas they deemed strategic, in the heart of the 14th arrondissement, beneath one of the city's main squares, the liberation was brewing.
The underbelly of Paris was always useful in difficult times. The work of these amateur cartographers, even though it was flawed, had opened new doors and possibilities, and allowed Rol-Tanguy's command center to do its work from August 20th to the 25th in full protection.
Between concrete walls, 26 meters underground, hid the secret headquarters of the Parisian resistance.
The Germans knew about the tunnels, but none of them ever imagined such movement.
The cherry on the cake was that the Germans were counting on a guard to sound the alarm in the event of a security breach. It was a well-established routine. Every day, a major called the guard on the phone at the command center. But the guard was actually a member of the resistance. Surrounded by Rol-Tanguy and his general staff, he would assure the major there was nothing to report. The Germans didn't verify anything on the field, allowing Rol-Tanguy and his men to launch an attack.
His wife typed out the famous call for mobilization on August 19th. Missions were sent out to the Allies to convince them to come to the French capital and free the people.
On August 19th, 1944, the first shots were fired. Paris was taking a stand. Between August 19th and the 22nd, the fighting intensified. The FFI, early resistance fighters, and anonymous civilians came together to fight the occupiers. On the 23rd, Hitler sent a telegram to von Choltitz saying, "Paris is not to fall in the hands of the enemy except as a heap of ruins."
Because they were losing, they tried to destroy everything. They sought to damage this beautiful city.
Hitler only had 16,000 men posted in the French capital, but he wanted his troops to resist until the very last bullet.
They set up barricades, they had solo snipers in position. There were still an estimated 900 to 1,000 FFI agents who lost their lives.
The population that had accepted and submitted for 4 years was getting revenge, and it was violent.
Suttel and Talairach were also in the streets of Paris. But it was as doctors caring for the wounded that Jean and René experienced the liberation. Under von Choltitz's orders, the Germans barricaded themselves in the Senate and its shelters. The Luxembourg sector was one of the last battle arenas.
600 men trying to hold it, among which multiple SS soldiers. It was a downright battle to the death. The bunker was a last resort, their last chance. They began to flee.
Suttel said he returned to the tunnels just after the last shots were fired and found SS uniforms on the ground, not far from the bunker at Lycée-Montagne. To escape the last battles, the Germans seemed to have changed into civilian clothes.
It's entirely possible that they fled through the underground tunnels. That could have happened. They didn't want to get caught, so they ran for their lives.
Without providing any additional details, Jean Talairach wrote,
"In the tunnels, an FFI squad took care of the Germans who fled their underground shelters, quickly and efficiently, thanks to our map."
August 25, 1944. The last bastions of the occupation's troops had fallen. Paris was free. The resistance fighters could come to the surface and abandon the bunker under Place Denfert-Rochereau. The FFI had accomplished their mission. The fighting, although brutal, had spared Paris from Hitler's ordered destruction. Rol-Tanguy, accompanied by General Leclerc, forced von Choltitz to sign the surrender of the occupying troops.
Paris was intact. Paris was saved. General Leclerc and Rol-Tanguy greeted General de Gaulle in Montparnasse.
The Paris insurrection certainly had its fair share of victims, grief, and suffering. But nevertheless, it was an overwhelmingly joyous liberation, a celebration in the sunshine for having chased out the hated occupant. It was a unique moment of communion in Paris and in French history.
The French flag once again hung at every corner. Images of the Führer on the Eiffel Tower seemed long gone. In the end, the fight for liberation didn't have to take place in the underground tunnels.
Sure, they could wander around the tunnels unbeknownst to the Germans, but they had to come up to attack or assist the liberation from the surface. They would have been killed one by one as they emerged. In August 1944, the Germans no longer held the city. One could get around relatively easily. Using the tunnels was actually counterproductive because it was slower and more complicated.
I think we were naive, because the Germans could have simply gassed the tunnels, and we would have died in the blink of an eye.
The persistent work carried out by the doctors since the start of the conflict provided real, decisive information, earning them recognition. Rol-Tanguy had both of them decorated. With Paris now free, Talairach chose to continue the fight against the Third Reich. Jean joined the First Army as a surgeon and accompanied the troops until the last battles in Germany. Only upon Germany's surrender did he return to his second home, Sainte-Anne. René Suttel left Paris. He stayed in France and also continued his career as a doctor. But his passion for Paris's underground never waned.
After the war, he went back down into the tunnels several times, usually with a small group of family or friends, more or less legally, shall we say.
He dedicated himself to writing a historical book about the capital's tunnels. It was published only after his death in 1981. And of course, the preface was written by Talairach. Suttel and Talairach's map long remained forgotten. only a small community of Parisian underground enthusiasts knew about these tunnels, which are a precious yet fragile part of Paris's heritage.
Did Suttel's map inspire others or leave any tangible traces?
What it left behind was a spirit of discovery.
Two men descended into darkness almost every night in the hopes that their map would help the resistance.
Whatever inspires someone to go underground, if they continue to do it, it's because they feel good down there. And that's even more prominent for Suttel in Talairach, because they risked their lives every time they went underground.
Accompanying them beneath the capital is a way to rediscover a number of overlooked stories. How the Nazis occupied and fortified a strategic sector beneath the Luxembourg Gardens. How the underground command center at Denfert-Rochereau ended up sheltering the resistance as they prepared for Paris's liberation. And how the courage of a few brave souls ultimately triumphed.